So wonderful. We are live now, and I say welcome behind your screens. I'm very happy to officially open the second out of 4 speaker series, this time on gender equality. The speaker series is part of the Thinkathon Online Challenge number 2, the last action of the 2-year project, Our Digital Future, CEC, a European-Canadian Youth Transatlantic Civil Society Dialogue. The project is granted by the EU Commission and realized by the Goethe Institut Montreal, Think Young, and Carrefour Jeunesse Emploi Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. My name is Annalena Grünagel. I'm the project manager at the Goethe Institut in Montreal. Through a series of actions, the aim of the project is to connect European and Canadian youth and youth organizations, as well as policymakers, to address challenges and opportunities in the digital world. The specific objectives of the project are to foster people-to-people contacts and exchange of views between young Canadians and Europeans aged between 18 and 30 on key parameters required to ensure that our digital future is inclusive. Second, to enable young Canadians and Europeans to jointly contribute to policymaking and on an inclusive digital future. And third, to increase public awareness and initiate a broad public discussion in Canada as well as in Europe. As mentioned at the beginning of our last action is the Thinkathon Online Challenge number 2, where over 200 teams composed out of 600 young adults from Europe and Canada signed up to work on a policy recommendation on how to make their digital future inclusive, focusing on the topics of racism, anti-racism, health, education, climate change, and gender equality. 50 teams made it into the second round last week and are now fine-tuning their policy recommendations. This speaker series is intended to offer food for thought for our participants, but also to animate the public getting involved and exchanging thoughts. So please feel free during our conversation and our discussion to ask your questions in the comment below the live stream. Please let me thank you, the European Union, for their financial support in order to realize this project, as well as our main partner, Agorize, and all our promotion partners in Canada and Europe. I would also like to thank our speakers for their commitment and engagement on the topic, gender equality, a topic that is not yet where it should be, and how can we reach the goal that all genders have equal rights and chances, not only in the real world, but also when it comes to the digital era. How can policy recommendations help putting the topic forward? I'm very looking forward to the discussion, and now I'm happy to hand over to our moderator, Fabian Ebeling. Fabian Ebeling is a Berlin-based freelance journalist, editor, and author who works for German media outlets like Taz, Die Tageszeitung, and Zeit Online. He's a co-publisher of The Epilogue, Journal for Contemporary Culture, and recently co-wrote a book about friendship, closeness, and socialization. Liebe, Körper, Wut und Nazis. Wie wir beschlossen, uns alles zu sagen. Please, Fabian.
Thanks, Annalena, and welcome to today's speaker session, our digital future mind the gender gap. And I'm very excited to host this talk today. We have 3 guests with us, Asha Allen, who is a policy and campaign manager for European Women's Lobby in Brussels, Wendy Sukir, who is the founder and director of Ryerson's University Diversity Institute in Toronto. Nancy Mitchell is joining us from Toronto as well, and she's currently working for the UN's We Empower G7 program. And of course, also a very warm welcome to everybody who's joining us in the audience today. I'd like to provide you all with a quick guide how this discussion is run today. The talk is divided into 4 segments. First, there will be a short round of inputs from each panelist. Secondly, we'll have a round of questions and discussion. And afterwards, it's the audience's turn to ask questions, and you can put them in the comment section, as Annalena pointed out already. And wrapping it up in the end, we'll have a quick checkout section. Each segment is timed, and I will hold up my phone for everyone to see when we reach halftime, just like I'm doing now for myself. And for the panelists, if you want to respond to something that was said, please raise your hand for me to see. That would be really helpful. So we're here to discuss today ways to bridge the gender gap in today's digital economy, and I would love to jump right into it. So let's move to the first round of inputs. Each panelist has 2 minutes to let us in on first the current topics or top projects that deal with closing the gender gap in the technology sector, and second, what they expect to take away from this panel today. And my timer is ringing already, so I'm too far in already. But yeah, you have 2 minutes each. I will take a look at the timer, hold it up at halftime, and I'd say we can start in alphabetical order by second name. So Asha Allen, please, it's your turn.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to this discussion. I think with a name that's AA, I always got to start at the top of the register in school, so it's something I'm quite used to. So yes, my name is Asha Allen. I'm a Policy and Campaigns Officer at the European Women's Lobby. We are the largest umbrella organisation of women's civil society in Europe. So we have over 2,000 member organisations representing about 50 million women across Europe. I coordinate our work around digitalization, and one of the projects that we've been working on concretely over the last 3 years is our Her Net, Her Rights project. And this is something that we're going to talk about in more detail, of course, as we go through the panel, as to something that I like to call the digital gender experience gap. And what that focuses on is online gender-based violence against women and girls. It started off as a project in which we mapped the prevalence of this. And then what we were able to do is to take that initial report, which became quite influential, influencing the work of the UN Special Rapporteur and the European Parliament, and turn that into a training session during the European election campaign of 2019. And we ended up training nearly 500 women, politicians, activists and journalists on digital safety, and outlining key recommendations, which are now being picked up by the European institutions on what we can do there. But we're also looking at the broader issue of gender mainstreaming EU digital policy. So that looks at women in STEM, the digital transition and the digital economy as well. And what I hope to get out of this is a great discussion on the need for a holistic intersectional approach to this issue, and for us to have a chance to talk about real solutions and how we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Nancy, please. Sorry, no, alphabetical order. Wendy Sukir, please, your turn.
It just depends on if you're using our first or our last names. My name's Wendy Sukir, and I'm a professor at Ryerson in the Entrepreneurship and Strategy Department. And the Diversity Institute's been working for about 20 years on issues related to gender equality and diversity more broadly. And it started with a focus on women in technology, because that's my background. I guess we have a series of projects that are focused specifically on that. We lead the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and we know that a lot of the challenges around the underrepresentation of women in STEM are then replicated in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, because so much of the focus on innovation and entrepreneurship is the Silicon Valley model of what an entrepreneur is. So these issues from our perspective are very complex and have to be looked at from a sort of cultural and societal level. We have to look at organizational practices, and then we have to look at individual attitudes and behaviors. And we have a model that's based in evidence, but focused on driving change, that looks at how the system creates barriers to women broadly and specifically in STEM. We also lead the Future Skills Center. And one of the things that for me is very important, and I'll continue to explain it, is that often we think about women in technology as synonymous with women in computer science or women in engineering. And of course, those are pathways. Of course, we have to focus on increasing representation in those domains. But the reality is there are way more jobs, way more opportunities in hybrid positions. And so the big area that we're focusing right now on is alternative pathways to STEM. If you look at the women who head the largest technology companies in North America, they are not engineers and computer scientists. And we have to break the association of engineering and computer science with good jobs in information technology. That's what I'll talk more about.
Sorry. Thank you. And what do you expect to take away? Is there something, maybe one thing that comes to mind?
I think the cross-cultural issues are really interesting because the levels of representation vary from country to country, and you're lucky to live in a country with the most impressive, one of the most impressive and powerful women leaders in the world. And Angela Merkel and the image that she presents probably has had an impact on the aspirations of young women in Germany. I'm interested in how those things play out.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So Nancy, for the 2-minute input, please.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's great to be here. So I'm Nancy Mitchell, and I work as a consultant with UN Women supporting the We Empower G7 program, which is funded by the EU and jointly put together by UN Women and the ILO. So the program is dedicated to empowering women to achieve their full economic potential, but then also, reaching out and engaging with the private sector primarily, but also public sector and civil society to ensure that gender equality is promoted in the world of work in general. And the program centers on the women's empowerment principles, which are a set of 7 principles that companies can follow to promote gender equality in the workplace, marketplace, and community. And so we're currently working on a piece related to STEM, but focused on women in the renewable energy sector, because as we see, globally, but specifically in Canada, women are underrepresented in renewable energy, at entry level, but also in high-ranking leadership positions. And so how can we kind of bridge this gap and remove these barriers? And then I'm also a member of the Prime Minister's Youth Council. And so as a council, we do some collective activism, but then, each council member does individual activism related to gender equality, innovation, climate change, etc. And I personally think it's really important to have a holistic view. So not just speaking about gender when we're speaking about the women and gender portfolio, but ensuring that women and gender considerations are adopted within the science and innovation portfolio, within the environment and climate change portfolio, et cetera. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our other panelists. I think this is a great group of incredible women who have great expertise. And I'm particularly interested in learning more about the alternative pathways to women in technology that Wendy was mentioning. I plan to talk a little bit about the pipeline in general for women in STEM, but I think that would be cool to hear. So yeah, did I hit the time? Awesome.
Thanks. I'm trying to avoid to have it ringing all over the place, so I keep the microphone muted. Thank you very much for these inputs. I'm really keen to learn more about what we touched upon already during this round of questions and discussion. And I'm sure we touched upon some of the things we already heard from you or learned from you. And I think we have roughly about 25 minutes now to learn about ways, measures, and tools to close the gender gap in the new economy's workforce in Canada and the EU. But just to frame it a little bit, in the EU, women barely at the moment represent 17% of the workforce in ICT jobs. In Canada, they make up more, around 27. So just to set things up, I'd like to ask you, Asha, please. Can you let us in from your perspective on the current state of women in the EU's ICT sector, and what would you say are the barriers for women, but also other genders, except male genders in tech?
Yes, of course. So I think that there's going to be some striking similarities, of course, between the experience in the EU countries, Europe more broadly, and our colleagues in Canada. And so I think it's the common theme here is to reiterate something that's going to be called the Leaky Pipeline when it comes to women in STEM technology or the ICT sector. And I think it's very, very important, as Wendy was saying, being very clear in what we're talking about and the difference between the ICT sector and women in technology fields. But to set the context, the European Union has the digital single market strategy. It has been its strategy for the last few years, and this strategy is about the digital transition, both economically and socially in Europe. And one of the objectives that they identified in their midterm review was the failure for having more women not only represented in the sector, but also benefiting, whether it was from an entrepreneurial perspective or economically or socially. So through this, they had conducted an analysis, and we were pleased to see that this analysis came out, because one of the other reoccurring themes that I think we're going to find here is that finding the experiences and the data can be quite difficult when the data is quite sporadic and it's not the same indicators across the EU, because we're dealing with 27 countries here. Formerly 28, but 27 countries here that may have different indicators for collecting what the experience is. But there were some general commonalities that we've picked up and we've looked at from our feminist analysis. And so we've looked at, of course, the issue of girls leaving STEM education, women leaving tertiary education in third level degrees, and of course, they're looking at women leaving the tech field. And one of the aspects that we've really tried to put forward is that it's not just an issue of a lack of interest or a lack of role models, because we feel like this has actually been quite a focus of political initiatives over the last few years in putting the onus on women and girls to saying there's a reason why you're not here and you just need more confidence or you just need to be in this space. And our feminist analysis is that the space isn't made with women in mind in the first place. So you're asking women and girls to insert themselves into this area that didn't really take them into consideration in the first place. So what the analysis showed was that in Europe, a young woman or a girl entering into tertiary education, so this is third level education, for a man, if they entered into a STEM field, there was about a 2 to 3% increase in their employability. For women in the same field, it was a 2 to 3% decrease, even if they had the degree. So we were trying to look at this issue from our analysis and trying to see what was the key aspects that were leading to this. Other research indicates, of course, that we need to look at this from a very holistic perspective. So what we were seeing is that, unfortunately, in the field, in the ICT sector, sexual harassment is one of the worst in terms of professional sectors. The only sector worse was the military. So we were looking at a situation in which women were asked to work in environments that were inherently unsafe in the first place. And there was a projection of gender stereotypes and sexual violence that was normalized because, once again, these environments were not really created. And the model that was being projected was not created with women in mind. Similarly, we see with women's entrepreneurship by the EU's own data, and unfortunately, they've been able to pick up on the errors that they've made. Despite women-led digital SMEs performing about 63% better than male-led SMEs, they received less than half the funding that was provided by the EU and by member states. So even there, the data didn't seem to make sense. It seemed like a lot of gender stereotypes were informing decisions around financing, around support, and of course, why women were not being entered into the space safely. Similarly, what we see when it comes to this discussion on role models, in Europe, we have something called the Women on Boards initiative. It's a legal initiative that we've been trying to push through for many, many years. There's been a pushback on this in regards to having more women in positions of leadership, both in the public and private sector. And we see time and time and again, based on the data that is available, that the ICT sector is one of the worst performing when it comes to women in leadership positions in the top 500 companies, ICT companies based in Europe. So this led us to a question on how is the environment built what are the issues that are being focused on when it comes to political, legal, or financial initiatives to try and rectify and close this specific gap and the barriers. And what we decided to do is to look at this more comprehensively. So the EWL is looking and scoping at this issue of gender mainstreaming digital policies, so that, exactly like Nancy was saying, that this doesn't come into a situation where we're only talking about it in the context of gender equality and women's rights, that actually gender mainstreaming and indicators are there and are part of all of the different aspects when it comes to the implementation of EU digital policies, which is actually required by the EU treaties. So this is what we're trying to aim to do over the next few years with our members.
Okay, Asha, thank you very much. You already touched upon STEM, I think, and on the transitioning from studies to the workforce, and that's why I wanted to address Nancy. Maybe I think at the pre-discussion you told us about that you were working on a report about women in STEM, if I'm correct here. Do you see similar issues like Asha described in Canada? And can you share which are the barriers that women face in STEM there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to talk similarly about the Leaky Pipeline. I think that there's some similarities there. It's difficult to put this into a short, concise piece, but what I'll say is I definitely agree with Asha, and I think there is a leaky pipeline starting from, elementary school education all the way up into senior leadership positions in the workplace. But I first want to start by, prefacing my comments with the fact that women are not a homogenous group, and neither are their experiences in STEM in general. So, if we do some digging, we see that perhaps women are more represented or active in science, biology, etc., and less represented in engineering, math, computer science. And then if we're looking across women in general, we see that women of color and racialized women are even less likely to be represented and actively engaged in STEM. So now in terms of the leaky pipeline, something that I think is helpful is to contextualize the issue related to supply and demand. And so supply would be, the number of women entering into STEM positions and then retained along the pipeline. But I want to be super clear that when I talk about supply, I'm not talking about whether women are qualified. I do think that there are opportunities for skill building, mentoring, etc. But I'm not trying to, I don't want my comments to be misconstrued to be saying that women are not qualified in STEM, as they absolutely are. But supply more relates to the barriers that bottleneck women from, early education to moving up, that hinders the amount of women that are moving along the pipeline. And then demand is, of course, looking at institutions. Are they promoting women? Are they recruiting women? Are they valuing women? Are they fostering inclusive workplaces? And as Asha mentioned, like our workplace is free from sexual harassment, gender-based violence, stereotypes, etc. So then in terms of the pipeline itself, I think a good place to start would be early childhood education and nurturing, girls' perceptions of themselves in STEM. I was looking at some reports, and it was saying that girls often feel like they are worse off in science, mathematics, technology, etc., despite the fact that they may have similar or higher test or score levels. And so if there are these perceptions early on, this really does bottleneck the amount of girls who are moving up into STEM positions, in post-secondary. And are we seeing that young girls are involved in STEM extracurricular activities at the same rate as their boy counterparts? So I think this does affect supply. And then I think another point along the pipeline is in post-secondary education. We see that in Canada, women are more likely to drop out of their STEM post-secondary education quite early on in first or second year. And so I don't credit this to difficulties in workload or difficulty in the topic. I credit it to, a lack of inclusive environments in post-secondary education, the persistence of gender stereotypes and the lack of opportunities afforded to young women in post-secondary early on. And so, to keep a robust supply, we need to be offering opportunities for young women early on in post-secondary education. And of course, there are instances where women from other disciplines are switching into STEM, but I just do want to flag that if women are going to drop out, it's in that first and second year. And then our last stop along the Leaky Pipeline, but this is of course not the last barrier that women experience, is in actually accessing, positions in the labor market. We see that women are underrepresented in entry-level positions in STEM or across STEM, and then in leadership positions. And so this is, of course, issues of supply, but issues of demand. Are workplaces actually valuing women's contributions in, STEM disciplines? Are they looking to hire women, to recruit women, to promote women? Are they free from gender stereotypes, both unconscious and conscious? Because we often talk about unconscious bias, but I think a lot of it is conscious bias as well. And then, as Asha mentioned, in the workplace, are they free from, sexual harassment? Is there an emphasis on parental leave, both for men and women and folks of all different gender identities? So, there's a lot we could go into, but along the Leaky Pipeline, I would say early childhood education, making sure that women are supported early on in their post-secondary education, and then making sure that you're recruiting women into STEM fields. I hope that was concise and wrapped up the whole situation in Canada.
I think that's great. Yes, we're almost approaching halftime for this segment, so it's totally fine. And I think the Leaky Pipeline is a good place to go move ahead from. And I'd like to ask Wendy, as someone with a perspective on teaching, I think in the world of the university, but also with a perspective from an institution like the Diversity Institute. How successful would you say have efforts been to encourage women to study STEM? That would be the first question. And what do you think, or what are actually digital jobs that are in demand right now, would be the second question here.
Yeah, thanks very much. So it's, the day after the 31st anniversary of the Montreal Massacre, where a man walked into a Quebec, Montreal University and separated the men from the women and killed 14 young women, many of them engineering students. And at that time, there was outrage over violence against women, but also the underrepresentation of women in engineering, because it was clear that the women were attacked because they had chosen engineering as their profession. So 31 years after, a number of initiatives and studies came out that called for action, and many institutions, making grand statements. There are fewer women in computer science today, and only marginally more in engineering. And I would say that there are a number of reasons why we haven't made progress. Partly, great statements are words on paper unless you have very intentional strategies that really look at the systems which produce and reproduce the barriers. And I don't think that we've had that level of commitment. So you have some engineering schools that have more than 30% women, and you have some that have 12 or 13. That tells you that it isn't the pool, that it has to do with the intentionality. The other thing that I think is really a problem with respect is the whole construction of STEM as something. Science graduates have worse employment outcomes than social science grads in Canada, and only marginally better than humanities grads. And yet we have put the science in with the technology and the engineering, because those disciplines are valorized, and they're valorized partly because they're male dominated. So I think that that's fundamentally one of the things that we have to grapple with, is that the preoccupation with STEM actually doesn't make a lot of sense, in that STEM alone is not enough to drive economic development or innovation or inclusion. And that's why I come back to what I said at the outset, which is the preoccupation with more women in engineering and computer science, of course, is important, and we should continue to push. But a more appropriate strategy is to really question what jobs really are required in order to advance innovation. And making technology does not equate to innovation. using technology differently drives innovation, and understanding how to effectively use technology, the forces driving adoption of technology, those are all the domains of social science graduates, of people who understand consumer behavior, organizational behavior, policy, and so on. And they get completely ignored in this obsession with STEM, STEM, STEM. And I can tell you that if you look at the impact of artificial intelligence, it's actually producing more low-code, no-code solutions, which do not require computer science to use. Arts graduates make far better data analysts because they can tell stories. So my argument is, if we actually are taking a gender and diversity lens and looking at the structures that are excluding women, we have to dig a lot deeper than asking questions about why there aren't more women in STEM. We have to ask questions about, why is STEM overvalued when the evidence does not actually support the way it's being framed?
Thanks, Wendy. Interesting point. And I think I'd like to play the ball back to Nancy here, because we're still with STEM in a way. What do you consider, also keeping in mind transitioning into the workforce? What do you consider useful measures and policies to improve women's transition from STEM to related fields in the workforce?
Yeah, thanks. I really agree with that statement. Something that we have looked at in our report on women in STEM, but women in renewable energy, is looking at like fields that are complementary. So for example, as Wendy mentioned, psychology, consumer behavior, law, communications, economics, and policy. You know, those are fields that a lot of women are represented in or engaged in that are complementary to technology or operate within technology, or would be helpful to have, you know, companies and firms recruiting folks, women, out of these other fields, because you know, it's important to know consumer behavior. It's important to know policy if you're going to be looking at the tech field. So I think, yeah, not just recruiting out of engineering, science, bio, physics, chem, et cetera, but looking at these complementary fields. I think it would be great to see the private sector doing some more digging deeper into like early catching women younger in the pipeline. And, you know, the Women's Empowerment Principles does have a principle on community advocacy and engagement. And I think it would be great to ensure that young girls have extracurriculars related to these topics or issues within STEM, or, you know, comparable complementary fields, to ensure they're engaged early on and to ensure that opportunities are equally distributed. So yeah, I think that would be helpful, but I definitely do agree with Wendy on that point of complementary fields.
Okay, thank you. And Wendy, also when I prepared for this talk today, I looked into one of your papers that you published, I think in 2019, and it was about skill gaps. And it deals with people that also probably, if I remember correctly, transition from studies into the workforce. It becomes evident that there can be skill gaps because technology and the economy or tech companies are moving fast, but the education isn't really keeping up. So there can be a gap. And I was wondering, what do you think are best approaches to upskilling and reskilling to meet demands, and what could be alternative pathways to digital skills?
Yeah, thanks for the question, because that is my area of passion. I mean, I did a master's degree in medieval history before, and I was working before I knew what an engineer even was. And once I started working with them, I figured anything they could do, I could do better. So it wasn't, and that sort of view really shaped my trajectory. I do think that we have to recognize that your university education is going to be out of date by the time you graduate. And so rather than trying to shift universities, which are very medieval and hard to change. I actually think the bigger opportunity is in developing alternative pathways, micro-credentials. You know, I experiment on my daughter. She has a master's degree in fine arts. I made her do a 1-week course in data analytics. She cried every day, and at the end, she was the top pick with the employers. And now she works at Boston Consulting Group and makes almost as much as I do. So there are these alternative ways, if you can break this stranglehold that the kind of STEM obsession has, and really look at what skills people have, take an asset-based approach, because we know that social and emotional intelligence, we know that understanding people and user interfaces and all sorts of things are massive barriers to effectively using technology. And so if we recognize those skills are actually harder to develop in some respects than the vocabulary around technology, and develop programs that build on where people are and help them transition. If we have better definitions of what the skills are and how to assess them and how to develop them, we will open up more opportunities. And I can give you one really good example. The OECD did a study of digital skills and used Ontario as an example. And the report said, digital skills, the #1 thing Ontario employers want. You unpack their definition of digital skills. 10% were Java programmers and software developers, which are hard to get. 15% were users of advanced programs like SAP, ERP, and so on, which are not hard to train up for. 75% of what employers said were digital skills was use of Microsoft Office and Excel. And unfortunately, what's happened is digital skills have become synonymous with engineering and computer science grads. We're preoccupied with developing coding from when people are babies, instead of thinking about where the real gap is. And the real gap, in my view, is having people who can think critically about technology and match it to organizational requirements in order to actually move organizations forward, as opposed to building systems nobody wants because they don't have any understanding of markets, humans, organizations, and so on.
Thanks, Wendy. I think, Microsoft Office and knowing how to use Slack or something like that, we all know it, looking at these job postings and everything. But I think it's a good transition to going a level lower in a way. And I'd like to ask Asha about I think, very fundamental thing, which is actually, we were talking about the digital divide in a way as well. And I'd like to just ask you a bit about the access to the digital world and the online world itself. How would you describe the gender gap or even various gender gaps here when it comes to the digital divide?
Yeah, of course. And I think that one of the things that we have to be clear about is that, you know, what manifests in kind of the economic employment field in regards to people's experiences from the gender gap is also being directly, if not indirectly, felt from a kind of sociocultural perspective as well. Everything is kind of part of this structure of patriarchy, right? Which is being felt in all the different levels. And so in terms of digital accessibility in Europe, I would take us back to something that Nancy said, actually, in regards to women obviously not being a homogenous group. I like to remind people that women are 51%, so 52% of the world population, so slightly the majority, and that is not a homogenous group. And what we see when it comes to accessibility is that it's more dependent on issues of income inequality and the experiences of marginalized groups, whether this is racialized or other groups, that actually determines in Europe, what's happening in regards to accessibility, not just based on gender. So this needs to be taken into consideration, because when it comes to initiatives in Europe around closing the digital gender gap, whether this is through education or through employment, these indicators are not often taken into consideration. So the EU actually has a digital action plan. It has a 9-step plan or 11-step plan in regards to increasing people's digital literacy, people's access to digital education, and is offering these initiatives. But when you get into the details, you realize how inaccessible these actually are. So if we're looking at women, for example, who are working and are offered these opportunities for digital education courses, it often doesn't take into consideration the other aspects of patriarchy that is affecting women. So work-life balance. Does this woman also have care responsibilities that she has to take into consideration? Are there other aspects that they have not considered when it comes to why someone isn't able to access, or why someone isn't able to further what is happening for them? In terms of also going back to some of the aspects that we spoke about in regards to the gap in regards to the support of young people in general when they come into these fields in Europe. So what you'll tend to find is that you may have a group of students in the same university course, possibly pursuing computer science, and you'll tend to find that women in those classes are then suggested that they may go into PR or communications in the tech field rather than continue their ambitions in regards to the very kind of technical thing. And this goes back to Wendy's point on the valuation of our different employability skills, because soft skills, which we have seen during the height of the COVID-19 crisis, is so desperately needed and so desperately relied upon in regards to the different kind of knowledge-based sectors that we have and the reliance that we have on those, is something that is just undervalued. And so what we say is that the feminization of jobs and how they are devalued deliberately, and what does this mean when it comes to STEM, and even the political will to put so much money and initiatives into that sector because it is so male dominated and because of how it is valued. So that's what we're seeing in kind of an educational going into the employment level. But we would really reiterate that the digital experience is a holistic one. It's about employment, and it's about exactly what we're doing right now. We are communicating online. Our entire world is digitalized. Our democracy is digitalized. And I think that's something that often gets talked about in a different context in regards to the safety of elections and things like this. But we want to highlight that women's experiences in the online space in general are just not safe. Women are 27 times more likely to be harassed online. Women politicians are 50 to 60% more likely to be harassed online. And often this is sexually violent, this is directly violent, and it leads to women having to unfortunately leave their employment, whether this is in politics, but we're talking about journalists, activists, we're talking about women from very different fields, women who have worked in different engineering fields as well. So what we're seeing is that this blurring between the analog and the digital in regards to our experiences, and what this means for women more broadly, and what is their digital experience. And this is the question I always like to pose when it comes to thinking about this digital sphere. And so I think it would be remiss also if I didn't mention in regards to this coming into health in the midst of the COVID pandemic crisis. What we were able to see during the crisis, of course, is this push to use digital tools to help hopefully respond to the crisis and really try and reinforce what could be done there. But we really had to push this message that if women have not been included in the development, if women are not included in the consultation, and women are not included in the implementation, add on top of that a lot of health data has gender stereotypes embedded into the very foundation of it, leading to certain machines being suggested that don't qualify how women experience heart attacks, for example, in comparison to men, then we have a real fundamental issue in what we understand in the digitalization of our communities, our society, our economy, and the experience of women in that as a whole. It really has to go beyond this discussion of there needs to be more girls coding, or if you're online, you just have to stop engaging with that person who's trolling you. So my final kind of thought on that would be, our analysis and our approach to this really must be holistic. I can't emphasize that enough. It needs to adopt an intersectional analysis. It really does, because without that, we can't really understand what's happening. And we need to use that theoretical framework in our approach in suggesting solutions, and understanding that actually without the input of women and girls and all different groups and communities, that actually the digital transition, whether it's in employment, education, or culturally, is just not going to benefit everyone equally.
Thanks, Asha. And I think holistic is a good word to. Yeah, it's a good. It describes the situation precisely, but it also shows that we have a 60-minute time window here, and we can't get everything covered here. There's a lot of ground to cover, of course, but I think we have collected some very interesting and foundational, fundamental points here up until now. We have 15 minutes left in this discussion in this group, and I think it's a good moment to open up the discussion to questions from the audience. And let's take maybe 10 minutes, and then we have 5 minutes left for some closing remarks to see if we can what we can cover here. You see the question, but I'm still gonna read it out to you. It's a question to Nancy from Ulfert Enver. Sorry if I don't pronounce the name correctly, but Nancy, in the media and more generally, individuals working in STEM are most often portrayed as this image of a nerd guy. How can we break this incorrect stereotype and encourage more girls to pursue STEM?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so the women's empowerment principles, one of the key components is supply chains, marketing, et cetera. And I think that it's really important for companies in general to just not put out this kind of message. Like, I would say that's simply the answer, to just ensure that, you know, companies or any kind of campaigns that are put out by the public sector, for example, or even the private sector of civil society, really critically look at the messaging that's underlying any of, you know, the folks that they have in their advertisements, in their marketing campaigns. Are women and men being, and folks of all different gender identities, being portrayed as empowered? You know, do you have the women as support roles in your marketing campaigns and the men as leading, you know, in tech fields, for example? Like, how are people being portrayed? And then do you have women in all their diversity portrayed as well? I think that it's just a question of companies being more intentional with the kind of messaging that they put out and just not putting out the nerd guy in general.
Good point, thank you. So we're waiting for more questions. I think there were 4 from the audience so far. Yeah, Silvia Romeo. I think this is not directed to a single person, so I'll just direct it to the panel. It is shocking to see that too many women are still experiencing gender stereotypes nowadays. How do you think companies can help support equal opportunities in countries that do not recognize equal pay? Do you think companies from big to small are doing enough steps towards a big change? So I think Asha or Wendy might maybe be interested in responding to this. Please go ahead. Yeah. Wendy?
Yeah, sure. I can go ahead on this unless Wendy wants to go ahead first.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so, yeah, it's a very good question, and I think the question of why women continue to experience gender stereotypes, not only professionally but culturally and socially, is a massive question that we need to address, and actually achieving gender equality at its heart, right? In regards to what is happening for the recognition of equal pay, the European Union is supposed to present this year binding measures for pay transparency. So by the end of this year or early next year. This would require the EU member states to implement this legal instrument so that there is pay transparency as a first step to working towards equal pay. For the EWL, we've been working on this. We have our feminist economics working group, and we've been doing this for the last 30 years in really advocating this idea of a feminist economy, right? So it's not just about equal pay, it's about equal pay for equal work of equal value, because this goes right back to this issue on the feminization of different sectors. So I'd go back to the example that I used earlier. During the COVID-19 crisis, we see that healthcare workers, service providers are some of those who experience quite low pay across the EU, and 73 to 83% of those were women. So it was women who kept Europe going during the health crisis, essentially. It was women who kept Europe going, and it's the same across the world. But you'll see that these sectors, the care sector that requires different skills and is predominantly populated by women, is valued less. And interestingly, of course, I think we can use the historical example of computers, right? So women were initially computers, as it were, and as this became a more male-dominated field, it became more valued and of more worth. So I think if we're able to bring in legal measures to implement this, then that's a great way forward. But of course, we also need to bring the private sector on board to show the benefits of that and show the benefits of having more diversity and valuing different skills fairly and equally.
Thanks, Asha. Wendy, was there something you wanted to add at this moment? No? Okay, thank you. Next question is coming in by Guillaume Tosca-Diaz. How do you think AI can reduce unconscious biases in recruitment? Wendy, yeah. You have to unmute, please.
Sorry. So AI, like any tool, can be for good or for evil. And so while our research has shown that two resumes with identical qualifications, Canadian education, Canadian experience, one with a foreign sounding last name and one with a name like Smith or Jones, get treated very differently in recruitment processes. And the same, lots of evidence on the impact of concealing the identity of an applicant, whether we're talking about auditions for orchestras or coding. However, and so it is possible that you can anonymize resumes, that you can use artificial intelligence in ways that will reduce the chances for bias. But the other problem, of course, we know about artificial intelligence it can also just reify those biases. So, for example, if the qualifications that are being screened for, and this is how some of the systems work, use historic data on who is currently in the roles, it will just replicate the status quo. So I think we have to be, very intentional when we use some of these new tools. I do think they have there are enormous opportunities to use them more effectively to level the playing field, but there's also real potential for more abuse, and there are lots of examples of that as well. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think we still have time, roughly 2 minutes for a last question. It's coming from G1 Lee. What is your advice to women and LGBTQ2AI individuals that we haven't really touched upon yet? So thank you for the question. Facing a glass ceiling in their career advancement. So I'm playing the ball to whoever would like to say something. Asha?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to see if Nancy wanted to go also.
Yeah, please.
No, you can go first and then I'm happy to follow.
Great. So I think this is a very interesting question, and thank you for the question in regards to the position of the advice given to women and LGBTQ S2A people in what they face in terms of the glass ceiling, rather than the opposite, in how do we bring the glass ceiling away for them so that there isn't a glass ceiling in the first place. So I think there's a multi-level answer to this, right? The need to be able to combat the stereotypes that affect all the different groups from the intersectional perspective, and to ensure that those stereotypes aren't being utilized in a discriminatory way, and that they are able to kind of overcome this specifically. But also then I would look into the kind of concept of a career advancement, and how looking at the role models who have already broken the glass ceiling already. But for me, it's always a foundational question. I always kind of come back to this, and how do we change the environment so that the onus, or burden is the wrong word, but that the energy used isn't on the people who are being discriminated against, in order to overcome that in the first place. So really, I would say we have to work together to change the environment so that there isn't this need for them to work additionally hard to go beyond this. But I pass to the other panelists if they have any other suggestions.
I don't disagree. I think there's no question that we need to look at systems changes and organizational practices. But I'm a pragmatist, and if I've got someone sitting in front of me who is looking for an opportunity, I'm not going to say wait for the revolution. So I think we have to have that kind of dual perspective where we focus on the barriers and taking away the glass ceiling, but we also equip people to be more successful. And my view is it's not rocket science. We know that often women have 95% of the qualifications required and still won't put their name forward. We have to encourage people to step out of their comfort zone, and we need others to support them, encourage them, mentor them, sponsor them. But a lot of women could move forward if they took more chances. And I think that we see this in politics, we see this in the corporate environment, we see this when we look at boards. It's getting a different mindset around what's the worst that will happen. You ask someone to sponsor you, mentor you, coach you, give you advice, all they can say is no. And I think that the whole socialization of girls to be nice and compliant and obedient is something we also have to fight, because I think you can make more demands and often be surprised at what you get as a result.
Nancy,
Yeah, I would say it's a good mix of both. I think in our work in particular, we look at long-term systems change, but then some of the, I wouldn't call them quick fixes, but some of the more easily tangible things that you can do in the moment. So if you're looking at women on boards, just instituting, age and term limits, for example, critical mass, mentoring, sponsorship, but then on the long-term side, what kind of, corporate culture changes can you make to ensure that women feel included and are valued and respected in the workplace, particularly in areas or industries that they are underrepresented in. I tend to agree with Asha and would say that the onus should not be placed more heavily on women or folks from the LGBTQ S2AI, but more on companies, the public sector, private sector, folks who are hiring, recruiting, and promoting women and folks of all different gender identities. I would say it's on them to implement really intentional policies to have some sort of change in corporate culture to ensure that, folks are respected, to have sexual harassment policies, to have policies to have women in leadership and have intentional recruitment, to change their recruiting methods, to not use such archaic, easily deferred kind of methods, but looking into other networks. How can you recruit from advocacy groups, for example? How can you change up your recruitment criteria to ensure that you have, a diverse pool of applicants? And then I think that's something that Asha touched on earlier that is a really big emphasis for me and for our program as well, is ensuring that you promote equal uptake of care responsibilities. I was looking at some data out of Europe, and it was saying that women in Europe, and that's obviously quite broad in general, but are in STEM are often hindered by the fact that they have care and domestic responsibilities. And companies don't often promote that equal uptake among women and men. And if we, promoted that more intentionally, I think that that would be a great way to ensure women's career advancement. And it's something that is often overlooked, but I think it's a really big piece of the puzzle as well. But yeah, definitely some change around stereotypes and putting the onus on actual companies and corporate cultures. And then, encouraging women to take advantage of the opportunities that are there, that are provided when we break down stereotypes and barriers.
All right, thank you very much, Nancy, for these points. We're reaching the end of this discussion, and it has been packed already. And I wonder if you were still up for a quick checkout round, like let's say just 1 minute, what you're taking away from this, so I can use my timer once again. And if that's okay for you, I'd like to start with Asha.
Yeah, sure. So I think that just very quickly, there's been a lot to learn, and I think it's very, very clear the need for people of different expertise to come together to talk about this more concretely. My experience in the European sphere has often been you tend to find the same people in the same spaces talking about the same things, which is all similarly when it comes to gender equality, right? When we're saying it's not a women's issue, it's an issue for everybody, and that it shouldn't just be women in the room talking about this particular issue. So this is what I would take away from it, the need for the diversity of expertise to come together regularly to discuss this and also to formulate the solutions needed to overcome this, because I think without one, I think that everyone on the panel complements each other very well, and without each other and that expertise, we're not going to have the solutions needed. So I hope the policymakers listening also take that into consideration when it comes to their consultations. But thank you for the invitation. It was a great discussion.
Thank you, Asha. On point. Wendy, please, 1 minute.
Sure, thank you so much. And I agree. I think it's very useful. I guess I'll say one thing that perhaps reflects my background in a business school, and that is that I do think that the programs that we've seen have been most successful are ones that are grounded, obviously, in sort of moral commitment to gender equality and the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, but also where we make clear what the value is to the audience that we're speaking to. So I don't think that we make very much progress with the private sector in presenting this just as a moral argument. I think it's far more effective to show them the concrete impacts of how getting this right will help them grow their business, avoid risk, enter new markets, and be more successful. So the whole business case has fallen out of favor in some quarters, but I still think it's really powerful, because at the end of the day, while businesses talk about corporate social responsibility, what they're really interested in is the bottom line, and we can show them that getting this right will advance their bottom line.
Thank you, Nancy. Sorry, Wendy. I'm sorry, I was already with the next one. Nancy, please, 1 minute to go.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, thanks again so much for having me on this panel. I think that all of the insights have been wonderful. I think taking away, some of the ways that we can solve some of the barriers along the leaky pipeline, but also I think it was interesting what was brought up about, complementary disciplines or fields that Wendy brought up, and how it's important to boost women up in STEM, but also to look at what kind of assets women or folks in general can bring to technology that aren't necessarily, thank you, that aren't necessarily, you know, in engineering or in physics or in mathematics, but are in policy or in law or in communications or in psychology, and having like a better balance of that. So yeah, I would say the pipeline, but also diversifying a little bit and looking at different assets and skills.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. And I think that ties it together nicely. Honestly, personally, I need some time to let this today's input sink in. And I'm really glad I got to host this panel today to learn more about your perspectives. Asha Allen, Wendy Sukir, and Nancy Mitchell. So thanks again very much for joining the panel today. And thanks to Think Young and Goethe Institut Montreal for putting it together. Carrefour Jeunesse Emploi Notre-Dame-de-Grâce and delegation of the EU to Canada, thank you for the support. And of course, thanks to the audience for joining in today. Yeah, have a good week, everyone, and stay healthy.